The Japanese tank commander couldn't believe what he was seeing. American fighter planes diving straight at his squadron, but these weren't dropping bombs. They were firing rockets and bullets that punched through his tank's armor like it was made of cardboard. These were P-47 Thunderbolts, 8 tons of aircraft carrying 8 machine guns, each bullet the size of a human thumb, traveling faster than sound. The Japanese had built their tanks to fight in jungle warfare against infantry. Their thickest armor was only 33 millimeters, about as thick as 3 smartphones stacked together. They never imagined they'd face flying battleships that could destroy a tank from half a mile away. One Japanese survivor wrote in his diary, "We trained to be samurai warriors in steel. Instead, we became sitting ducks in tin cans." In just 3 weeks before the war ended, American Thunderbolts destroyed over 1,200 Japanese tanks, and the crews inside never stood a chance. But here's what nobody talks about. Those P-47 pilots had no idea they were shooting at tanks that couldn't fight back. What happened when American technology met Japanese courage? And why did one Japanese tank mechanic say the Thunderbolts saved his country by destroying it? July 16, 1945. The Japanese homeland prepared for an invasion that military planners believed inevitable. Across southeastern Honshu, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Army's 4th Tank Regiment positioned his squadron of Type 97 Chiha medium tanks among the rice paddies and bamboo groves that had fed Japan for centuries. These were not the vast steppes of Russia or the open deserts of North Africa, where tank warfare had evolved into a chess match of armor and guns. This was Japan, where every hillside could hide a tank, where morning mist rising from flooded rice fields could conceal entire armored formations, where the very landscape seemed designed to favor the defender. Tanaka's confidence came from careful preparation and what he believed was superior knowledge of the terrain. His tanks were painted in patterns that mimicked the dappled shadows of bamboo forests. Crews had spent weeks practicing concealment, learning to position their vehicles so that American reconnaissance aircraft would see only what appeared to be farmers' sheds or natural rock formations. The Type 97 Chiha, with its low profile and 57mm gun, had been the backbone of Japanese armored forces since 1937. It had served effectively in China, where it faced mostly infantry and light weapons. It had fought in Burma and the Philippines, where jungle terrain neutralized the Americans' supposed advantage in firepower. But as Tanaka supervised the camouflaging of his tanks that morning, he was operating under a fatal misunderstanding that would soon cost thousands of Japanese tankers their lives. The Japanese General Staff had based their defensive planning on reports from German military attachés who described the tank battles in Europe. They read about Tiger tanks with 88mm guns and armor over 100mm thick, dueling with Soviet T-34s and American Shermans. They studied the battles of Kursk and the Ardennes, where tanks fought tanks in massive armored clashes. What they failed to understand was that the Pacific War had evolved along entirely different lines, and the weapon that would destroy Japanese armor wasn't another tank, but an aircraft that had undergone a transformation the Japanese military intelligence had completely missed. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had originally been designed as a high-altitude escort fighter, meant to protect B-17 bombers over Germany. With its massive Pratt & Whitney double Wasp engine producing 2,800 horsepower, it could climb to 40,000 feet and fight effectively in the thin air where German interceptors tried to attack American bomber formations. But as the war progressed, American engineers and tacticians discovered something remarkable about this 8-ton fighter. Its rugged construction, originally designed to survive high-altitude combat, made it nearly indestructible at low altitudes. Its 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, intended for air-to-air combat, proved devastatingly effective against ground targets. Most importantly, its ability to carry bombs and rockets turned it from a defensive escort into an offensive weapon of terrifying efficiency. The P-47N variant that appeared in the Pacific Theater in early 1945 represented the culmination of 3 years of combat experience. Extended wing fuel tanks gave it a range of over 2,000 miles, allowing it to reach Japan from bases in Okinawa and Ieishima. The aircraft could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, but more significantly for Japanese tanks, it could mount 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each with a shaped charge warhead capable of penetrating 4 inches of armor plate. To put this in perspective, the heaviest armor on a Japanese Type 97 tank was 33 millimeters, just over 1 inch. The mathematical mismatch was staggering, but Japanese planners didn't know these specifications. They were preparing for a threat that had already evolved beyond their comprehension. Major Robert Dunham of the 318th Fighter Group had been flying P-47s since 1943. He had started in Europe, escorting bombers over Germany, then transferred to the Pacific, where he discovered an entirely different war. In Europe, enemy tanks were formidable opponents that required specialized tactics and often multiple attack runs to destroy. In the Pacific, Japanese armor was so thin that standard .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds could penetrate it from almost any angle. During training exercises in the Philippines using captured Japanese tanks, Dunham and his fellow pilots made a shocking discovery. The API rounds didn't just penetrate Japanese armor, they often passed completely through, entering one side and exiting the other, creating a deadly shower of metal fragments inside the crew compartment. The Japanese tank crews training for the defense of the homeland in summer 1945 were a mixture of veterans and newly conscripted boys, some as young as 15. The veterans knew the limitations of their equipment but maintained the strict discipline and warrior spirit that had defined the Imperial Army since its modernization in the Meiji era. They taught the newcomers that technology was secondary to fighting spirit, that a determined crew could overcome material disadvantages through superior tactics and willingness to sacrifice. This philosophy had worked in China against poorly equipped nationalist forces. It had achieved some success in the early Pacific campaigns when Allied forces were still learning jungle warfare. But it was about to collide with a reality that no amount of warrior spirit could overcome. Sergeant Akira Yamamoto, a tank driver with 3 years of combat experience in Burma, kept a private diary that would only be discovered decades after the war. His entries from July 1945 reveal a man caught between duty and despair. He wrote about training new crew members, boys who had never driven anything more complex than a bicycle, teaching them to operate machines he knew were death traps. The Type 95 Hago light tank he commanded had armor only 12 millimeters thick at its strongest point. He had seen what aircraft strafing could do to trucks and infantry in Burma. He could only imagine what it would do to his tank. Yet, he continued training, continued preparing, because the alternative, surrender, was literally unthinkable in the culture of the Imperial Japanese military. The American pilots preparing to attack Japan underwent a very different training regimen. At bases across Okinawa and Ieishima, they practiced skip bombing, rocket attacks, and low-level strafing runs. They studied Japanese equipment recognition charts, learning to distinguish between different types of vehicles and prioritize targets. But the intelligence they received was often outdated or incorrect. They were told Japanese tanks were comparable to early war Soviet models, with armor thick enough to require rockets or bombs for effective engagement. The reality they would discover was far different. Japanese tanks were designed for a different war, a different doctrine, and were catastrophically vulnerable to the weapons the P-47 carried as standard armament. The stage was set for one of the most one-sided engagements in armored warfare history. On one side, Japanese tank crews prepared defensive positions with careful attention to concealment and fields of fire, ready to sell their lives dearly in defense of the homeland. On the other, American pilots climbed into aircraft that represented the pinnacle of industrial warfare, machines that could deliver more firepower in a single pass than an entire artillery battery. Neither side fully understood what was about to happen. The Japanese didn't know that their carefully prepared positions would be visible from the air, that their camouflage designed to fool high-altitude reconnaissance would be useless against low-flying fighter bombers. The Americans didn't know that the targets they were about to engage were so vulnerable that using rockets would often be overkill. that machine gun fire alone could turn a Japanese tank into a burning coffin. The first systematic tank hunting missions over the Japanese mainland began in earnest during the last week of June 1945, though neither side recognized them as the beginning of a new chapter in armored warfare. P-47 pilots from the 318th Fighter Group, based on the small island of Iishima, were initially tasked with targets of opportunity: military vehicles, trains, and coastal shipping. But as they ranged deeper into Kyushu and southern Honshu, they began encountering something unexpected: large concentrations of Japanese armor moving under cover of darkness and hiding during daylight hours. Lieutenant James Pierce, flying his P-47N nicknamed Arkansas Traveler, described his first encounter with Japanese tanks in a letter to his wife that military censors would hold for months. On July 2, 1945, while returning from a strike against rail infrastructure near Kagoshima, he spotted what appeared to be wooden sheds arranged in perfect rows along a tree line. Something about their spacing seemed too regular, too military. He descended from 8,000 feet to 2,000 for a closer look. As his angle changed, he realized these weren't sheds, but tanks covered with wooden frames and foliage. He counted at least 30 vehicles attempting to hide in plain sight. What happened next would establish a pattern repeated dozens of times over the following weeks. Pierce called in his discovery to his flight leader, who authorized an immediate attack. 4 P-47s lined up for strafing runs, approaching at 400 miles per hour just above treetop level. Pierce later described the attack with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal horror. His 8 machine guns, each firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds at a rate of 800 rounds per minute, created a convergent stream of destruction that literally sawed through the first tank's turret. The camouflage netting and wooden framework burst into flames, followed seconds later by an explosion as the tank's ammunition detonated. The Japanese tank crews had perhaps 5 seconds of warning, the sound of approaching aircraft engines, before their world exploded. Those who survived would describe the experience as being inside a steel drum while someone fired a machine gun at it. The armor-piercing rounds didn't just penetrate. They created a phenomenon called spalling, where the impact would cause the inner surface of the armor to fragment, sending deadly metal shards ricocheting through the crew compartment. Tank Commander Corporal Masao Fujita, one of the few survivors from that first attack, would later testify that he watched his gunner simply disappear, transformed into what he could only describe as red mist by multiple .50 caliber rounds passing through the tank's thin armor. The tactical implications of these early encounters sent shockwaves through both commands, though for very different reasons. American intelligence officers were astounded by the vulnerability of Japanese armor. Captain Theodore Morrison, an intelligence analyst with the 5th Air Force, compiled a report that seemed almost impossible to believe. Japanese tanks could be destroyed by machine gun fire alone. Their armor was so thin that rockets, which pilots had been trained to save for high-value targets, were often unnecessary. A single P-47 with full ammunition could theoretically destroy 8 to 10 Japanese tanks in a single sortie. The report was initially dismissed as exaggeration until gun camera footage confirmed every claim. On the Japanese side, the reaction was one of horrified recognition, followed by desperate improvisation. Colonel Takeshi Nakamura, commanding the 2nd Tank Regiment, received reports of the attacks with disbelief that turned to despair. His unit's doctrine, developed over years of combat in China and refined in the Pacific Islands, was suddenly obsolete. Tanks that had been positioned to repel landing craft and support infantry were being hunted from the air with impunity. He ordered immediate changes. All movement would occur at night. Tanks would be dispersed rather than concentrated, and crews would dig revetments that might provide some protection from aerial attack. But these adaptations came too late and offered too little protection. The P-47 pilots quickly developed tactics that maximized their advantages. They would approach Japanese positions at extremely low altitude, often below 100 feet, using terrain to mask their approach until the last moment. The first pass would use machine guns to suppress any anti-aircraft fire and identify targets. The The second pass would employ rockets if hardened positions were encountered, or continue with guns if engaging tanks in the open. The third pass, if needed, would finish off any vehicles attempting to escape. The human cost of these attacks was catastrophic for the Japanese. Each Type 97 medium tank carried a crew of 4: commander, gunner, loader, and driver. The Type 95 light tank had 3 crew members. When a tank was hit by multiple armor-piercing rounds, the chances of survival were virtually nil. Bodies were often so badly damaged that identification was impossible. Japanese military tradition required cremation and the return of ashes to families, but tank crews hit by P-47 attacks often left nothing recoverable. Families received empty urns and were told their sons had died honorably for the emperor, never knowing the industrial efficiency of their deaths. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese tank crews was profound and largely undocumented in official records. Private letters and diaries discovered after the war reveal men trapped between their warrior code and the reality of their situation. Sergeant Yoshio Tanabe wrote to his mother in late July 1945, though the letter was never sent. "We are told that spirit will overcome material disadvantage, but spirit cannot stop bullets that pierce our armor as if it were paper. We sit in our tanks knowing that the sound of aircraft means death, unable to fight back, unable to run. This is not the warrior's death we were promised." American pilots were experiencing their own form of psychological stress, though of a different nature. Many had transferred from the European theater, where ground attack missions were dangerous affairs, with heavy flak and the possibility of encountering enemy fighters. In Japan, the opposition was minimal. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses were primitive compared to German flak, and Japanese fighters were increasingly rare due to fuel shortages and the preservation of aircraft for kamikaze attacks. The P-47 pilots found themselves in an almost surreal situation, conducting what amounted to execution missions against enemies who couldn't effectively fight back. Major Robert Dunham would later reflect on this period with deep ambivalence. In a 1987 interview, he said, "We'd go out on these missions knowing we'd find tanks, knowing we'd destroy them, knowing the crews inside had no chance. It wasn't combat, it was slaughter. But we also knew that every tank we destroyed meant it wouldn't be firing at Marines on invasion beaches. We told ourselves we were saving American lives, and we were. But that doesn't mean it was easy to live with." The technical mismatch between American and Japanese equipment extended beyond just armor thickness. Japanese tanks lacked radios in all but command vehicles, making coordinated responses to air attacks impossible. Their anti-aircraft armament typically consisted of a single 7.7mm machine gun, a weapon designed in the 1930s that was completely inadequate against aircraft attacking at 400 miles per hour. The tank's engines, designed for fuel efficiency rather than power, couldn't generate enough speed to escape once spotted. Even their camouflage, effective against high-altitude reconnaissance, was useless against low-flying fighters, whose pilots could distinguish details as small as individual track links. The morning of July 24, 1945, would enter the hidden history of the Pacific War as one of the most devastating demonstrations of technological superiority ever witnessed. Near Nagoya, the Japanese 11th Tank Regiment had assembled for what was supposed to be a carefully orchestrated redeployment. 112 tanks, a mixture of Type 97 mediums, Type 95 lights, and even some of the newer Type 3 Chinu tanks with their improved 75mm guns, were moving in company-sized formations along rural roads, believing they were safe from American observation. The movement had been planned for weeks, timed to avoid American reconnaissance flights, using routes that kept them away from major targets the Americans were known to monitor. What the Japanese commanders didn't know was that American intelligence had broken their military codes months earlier and was reading their operational messages almost in real time. The tank concentration had been identified, tracked, and designated as a priority target. 40 P-47 Thunderbolts from the 318th and 413th Fighter Groups took off from Aishima at dawn, each aircraft carrying full ammunition loads and 8 5-inch rockets. The pilots had been briefed to expect heavy resistance, possibly including the new Japanese anti-aircraft tanks they'd been warned about. The reality would prove far different. Squadron Leader Major William Patterson led the first wave of 16 aircraft. As they approached the target area at 15,000 feet, he could see the dust clouds from the moving armor columns from 20 miles away. The Japanese had made a fatal error in their timing. Morning mist that might have concealed them had burned off, and the summer sun created perfect visibility. Patterson's gun camera footage, declassified in 1975, shows what happened next with clinical clarity. The P-47s split into 4-plane divisions, each taking a separate column of tanks. They descended in perfectly coordinated dives, reaching attack speed of 425 miles per hour at 1,000 feet altitude. The first indication the Japanese tank crews had of danger was the distinctive whistling sound of diving aircraft, a sound that veterans of the Burma campaign recognized with immediate terror. Tank Commander Lieutenant Saburo Hayashi, one of only 17 survivors from the entire regiment, would later describe those seconds. "We heard them coming and knew we were dead. There was no cover, no time to disperse. I screamed at my driver to get off the road, but where could we go? Rice paddies on both sides would bog us down immediately. We were trapped in a column on a raised road, perfect targets." The P-47's first pass was devastating beyond anything in the tactical manuals. Each aircraft's 850 caliber guns fired convergent streams that focused at 400 yards, the optimal distance for ground attack. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds, designed to penetrate aircraft aluminum and engine blocks, cut through Japanese tank armor as if it didn't exist. The lead tank in each column was hit first, blocking the road. The rear tank was hit next, trapping the entire column. Then the P-47s worked methodically forward, each pilot taking individual targets. Private First Class Kenji Nakamura, a loader in the 8th tank of his column, survived because his tank's engine failed just as the attack began. The crew had dismounted to check the problem when the P-47s arrived. From a drainage ditch beside the road, Nakamura watched his entire company die in less than 3 minutes. His account, recorded by American occupation forces in 1946, provides one of the few eyewitness descriptions. "The American planes came so low, I could see the pilots' faces. Their guns made a sound like tearing fabric, very fast, very loud. Each tank they hit would spark like a welding torch, then smoke, then burn. Some exploded immediately. Others, the crew, would try to escape, but the planes would circle back and shoot them as they ran. The technical destruction was absolute. Post-war analysis of the battle site revealed that most tanks had been hit by between 50 and 200 armor-piercing rounds. The Type 95 light tanks, with armor only 12 mm thick, showed exit holes larger than entry holes where rounds had passed completely through, tumbling and expanding as they went. The Type 97 mediums fared no better. Their 33 mm frontal armor was designed to stop rifle bullets and shell fragments, not half-inch projectiles traveling at 2,110 feet per second. Even the newer Type 3 Chinook tanks with improved 50 mm armor were perforated like colanders. But it was the use of rockets that turned destruction into annihilation. The 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets carried shape-charge warheads, originally designed to penetrate submarine hulls. Against Japanese tank armor, they were grotesquely overmatched. Gun camera footage shows rockets hitting tanks and simply erasing them. Turrets flying 50 feet into the air, hulls split open like cracked eggs, entire vehicles reduced to burning fragments. One P-47 pilot, Lieutenant Eugene Robinson, reported that he stopped using rockets after his second pass because there wasn't enough left of the tanks to waste a rocket on. The human toll defied comprehension. Each tank represented 3 to 5 human beings, most between 18 and 25 years old. When armor-piercing rounds penetrated the crew compartment, they created what military scientists clinically call catastrophic personnel casualties. The kinetic energy of the rounds, combined with spalling effects and secondary explosions from ammunition and fuel, meant that crew members often simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. Japanese graves registration units, arriving days later, could identify only 143 individual bodies from 112 destroyed tanks that should have contained over 400 crew members. The psychological impact rippled through the entire Japanese military structure. Colonel Hideo Nakamura, who had commanded the destroyed regiment, committed suicide that evening rather than report the loss to his superiors. His farewell letter, discovered in military archives decades later, reveals the depth of his despair. I trained these men to fight with honor. Instead, I led them to slaughter. They died without firing a shot, without even seeing their enemy, except as shadows against the sun. There is no honor in this death, no glory for their families. I have failed in every measure of command. American pilots returned to base with mixed emotions that would haunt many for decades. Captain James Mitchell, who destroyed 7 tanks in the Nagoya action, wrote in his private journal, "It was like a shooting gallery at a carnival, except the targets had people inside. We flew back in silence. Nobody wanted to talk about what we'd done. We knew it was necessary. These tanks would have killed Marines on the beaches. But necessary doesn't mean easy. I threw up after landing, and I wasn't the only one." The strategic implications were immediate and overwhelming. Japanese plans for the defense of the homeland had assumed their tank forces would be held in reserve, then committed at crucial moments to throw American landing forces back into the sea. The Nagoya Massacre, as it became known among Japanese officers, proved this impossible. Tanks couldn't be concentrated without being discovered and destroyed. They couldn't move in daylight without being hunted from the air. They couldn't even hide effectively, as American pilots became expert at recognizing camouflage attempts. By early August 1945, the systematic destruction of Japanese armor had created a crisis that went beyond military tactics to strike at the heart of Japanese military culture. The Imperial Army's Tank Corps, once considered elite units worthy of the samurai tradition, had become what survivors privately called death lottery units. The phrase, found in a soldier's letter intercepted by American intelligence, revealed the depth of demoralization. Tank crews were drawing lots to see who would perform maintenance outside the vehicles, knowing that being inside when P-47s appeared meant certain death. The attempted rail movement of August 1, 1945 represented Japan's last major effort to preserve its armored forces for the anticipated invasion. The plan seemed foolproof. Load tanks onto railway flat cars for rapid night movement, avoiding the exposure of road travel. The 7th Tank Regiment's 93 tanks would travel from Kumamoto to defensive positions near Fukuoka in a single night, arriving before dawn to disperse into hidden positions. The train would move through mountainous terrain that should have provided cover from aerial observation. Railroad tunnels would offer shelter if aircraft appeared. Every detail had been considered except one. American signals intelligence had intercepted and decoded the movement orders 3 days earlier. Lieutenant Colonel David Anderson led 24 P-47s from the 348th Fighter Group on what would become known among pilots as the turkey shoot that wasn't funny. They found the train just after sunrise, emerging from a tunnel into a valley near Fukuoka. The locomotives were destroyed first with rockets, bringing the entire train to a stop on an exposed stretch of track with steep embankments on both sides. The tanks, secured to flat cars with chains and blocks, couldn't dismount quickly even if their crews had time. They didn't. Sergeant Takeshi Yamada, commanding a Type 97 tank in the middle of the train, survived by what he would later call the mathematics of massacre. His tank was hit early in the attack, with armor-piercing rounds killing his gunner and driver instantly. Wounded and trapped in the commander's position, Yamada played dead for the next 20 minutes as P-47s methodically destroyed every tank on the train. His testimony, given to war crimes investigators who initially suspected him of cowardice, provides the only detailed account of what happened inside the tanks during the attack. The first rounds came through the armor with a sound like hammers on steel drums. Yamada recalled. But immediately after came the fragments, pieces of our own armor flying through the compartment like bullets. My gunner's head simply disappeared. My driver was cut in half at the waist. The loader, just 17 years old, screamed for perhaps 3 seconds before rounds came through his position. I was covered in their blood, their flesh. I closed my eyes and pretended to be dead, feeling the tank shake as more rounds hit, hearing other tanks exploding around me. The P-47 pilots conducting the attack faced their own psychological burden. Flight leader Major Thomas Crawford had flown 63 missions over Japan, but this one would haunt him for the rest of his life. In a 1995 interview, shortly before his death, he broke 50 years of silence about that morning. It wasn't combat. Combat implies both sides can fight. This was execution. Those tanks couldn't move, couldn't run, couldn't shoot back effectively. We made pass after pass, pouring rounds into immobilized targets. I could see tank crews trying to escape, climbing out of hatches, jumping from the flat cars. Some of the guys shot them, others let them go. There were no rules for this kind of thing. We'd become exterminators, not warriors. The destruction was so complete that Japanese authorities initially refused to believe the reports. 93 tanks destroyed, over 400 crew members killed, not a single American aircraft lost. General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff, demanded photographic evidence, unable to accept that an entire regiment could be eliminated in 20 minutes. When reconnaissance photos confirmed the destruction, he ordered that the information be classified at the highest level. The Japanese public, being prepared for a final decisive battle, could not be told that their armor forces were being systematically eliminated without being able to fight back. The impact on remaining tank crews was immediate and devastating. Desertions, previously almost unknown in the Imperial Army, began occurring regularly. Military police reports from August 1945, discovered in occupation archives, document dozens of cases of tank crew members abandoning their units. The reasons given in interrogations were remarkably consistent. They refused to die in metal coffins without the chance to fight back. One deserter, Private Hiroshi Sato, told military police, "I joined the army to die for the emperor if necessary, but as a warrior, not as a target in a shooting gallery. There is no honor in being killed by an enemy you cannot see, cannot reach, cannot fight." Even more disturbing to Japanese commanders were reports of tank crews sabotaging their own vehicles. Maintenance logs from several units show suspicious patterns of mechanical failures that rendered tanks inoperable just as movement orders arrived. Engines that mysteriously seized, transmissions that failed without warning, fuel systems that developed unfixable leaks. While never proven, the pattern was clear. Crews were choosing court-martial over certain death from the air. The Japanese military's response revealed the depth of their desperation. New tactical manuals were hastily distributed, ordering tank crews to abandon vehicles at the first sound of aircraft engines and take cover at minimum safe distances. This unprecedented order, essentially telling tank crews to run from their vehicles, violated every principle of Bushido and military discipline. Tank commanders were authorized to execute crew members who hesitated to return to their vehicles after aircraft passed. These draconian measures only accelerated the collapse of morale. Meanwhile, American pilots were perfecting their tank hunting techniques to an almost industrial efficiency. They developed what they called tank runs, specific routes over Japan that reliably produced targets. Intelligence officers maintained detailed maps marking every confirmed tank kill, every suspected hiding place, every possible assembly area. Pilots competed informally for tank kills, with some aircraft sporting rising sun flags for each tank destroyed, though this practice was officially discouraged as it emphasized the one-sided nature of the engagements. The final 2 weeks before Japan's surrender saw the complete collapse of the Imperial Army's tank forces as a coherent military entity. What had begun as a technological mismatch had evolved into something that transcended military operations. It had become a demonstration of the futility of continued resistance. By August 6, 1945, the day the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, American intelligence estimated that fewer than 300 operational Japanese tanks remained in the home islands, down from over 2,000 just 6 weeks earlier. The P-47 Thunderbolts had accomplished what invasion planners thought would require months of ground combat and tens of thousands of casualties. The discovery of Training Regiment 14's facility near Kumamoto in late August 1945, days after the Emperor's surrender broadcast, revealed the final tragedy of Japan's tank forces. American occupation forces found evidence that over 2,000 boys between ages 14 and 17 had been training as replacement tank crews. They had been designated for special attack units, essentially tank-borne kamikaze formations intended to ram American landing craft and amphibious vehicles. But the P-47 strikes had destroyed not only their training tanks, but the very concept of their sacrifice. The boys had been practicing in wooden mock-ups, learning to operate controls in vehicles that no longer existed. Master Sergeant Harold Thompson of the 2nd Marine Division, part of the 1st Occupation Forces to inspect Japanese tank facilities, documented what he found in a report that remained classified until 1975. We found workshops where they were trying to add extra armor plates using boilerplate steel and even concrete. Tanks with logs strapped to their sides, thinking it might stop our .50 caliber rounds. They were welding cage-like structures over turrets, hoping to make our rounds detonate early. None of it would have worked. It was desperate and pathetic. In one facility, we found the bodies of 3 tank crew members who had committed suicide rather than surrender. Their note said they had failed to protect their machines. The human cost of the tank war that never truly was can only be estimated. Japanese records, many destroyed in the final days before surrender, suggest that approximately 3,800 tank crew members died in the home islands between June and August 1945. American records show that P-47 squadrons claimed 1,147 tanks destroyed in the same period, though post-war analysis suggests the actual number was closer to 1,400, with many targets being counted multiple times or misidentified vehicles. What these numbers fail to capture is the complete destruction of Japanese armored doctrine and the psychological collapse it precipitated. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, the tank commander from our opening, survived the war through what he would later call divine intervention or cosmic irony. On August 9th, the day Nagasaki was bombed, his squadron was scheduled to move to new positions. That morning, P-47s caught them in the open. Tanaka's tank was third in line when the attack began. He watched the first 2 tanks destroyed in seconds, his driver frozen with fear, unable to move. Then, inexplicably, the P-47s broke off their attack. Tanaka would learn later that they had received word of a massive B-29 raid approaching and were ordered to clear the airspace. His tank sat immobilized by terror for 3 hours before the crew could bring themselves to move. In a 1975 interview with Japanese historian Masanori Ito, Tanaka reflected on those final weeks. "We knew we were already dead. Every morning, we would perform our duties knowing that the sound of aircraft meant the end. We weren't soldiers anymore. We were sacrificial offerings to a war that had already moved beyond us." When the Emperor announced surrender, my first feeling wasn't shame or anger. It was relief. Pure, simple relief that I wouldn't have to climb into my steel coffin again. American P-47 pilots struggled with their own psychological aftermath. Major Robert Dunham, who had led dozens of tank hunting missions, found himself unable to discuss his service for decades. In a 1990 letter to a fellow pilot, he wrote, "People want to hear about dogfights with zeros, about heroic combat against equal opponents. How do you tell them you spent 3 months destroying tanks that couldn't fight back? How do you explain that you were so good at killing that the enemy gave up? There's no glory in that story, only necessity and sadness." The strategic impact of the P-47's dominance over Japanese armor extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Japanese post-war industrialists, many of whom had been involved in tank production, took the lessons of 1945 to heart. The founder of what would become Toyota, Kiichiro Toyota, had managed tank production facilities during the war. He later said that watching American mass production and technological superiority taught him that Japan's future lay not in military resistance, but in industrial adaptation. The precision, efficiency, and overwhelming force of American air power became a model for Japanese post-war manufacturing, turned from destruction to construction. The moral complexities of the P-47 versus Japanese tanks remain difficult to reconcile even decades later. On one hand, the destruction of Japanese armor undoubtedly saved hundreds of thousands of lives, both American and Japanese, that would have been lost in an invasion. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, anticipated over 1 million Allied casualties and up to 10 million Japanese deaths. The tank forces destroyed by P-47s would have extracted a terrible toll on landing beaches, turning every beachhead into a bloodbath. Their elimination before the invasion meant those battles never had to be fought. On the other hand, the one-sided nature of these engagements challenges traditional notions of warfare and honor. The young Japanese men who died in their tanks weren't given the warrior's death their culture had promised them. They died in industrial killing grounds, victims of a technological mismatch so complete that resistance was meaningless. Their sacrifice, intended to inspire future generations, instead became a cautionary tale about the futility of spirit against superior firepower. The last combat mission by P-47s against Japanese tanks occurred on August 14, 1945, hours before the Emperor's surrender broadcast. 4 Thunderbolts from the 414th Fighter Squadron encountered a column of Type 95 light tanks near Nagoya, apparently attempting to reach defensive positions, unaware that the war was ending. Flight leader Captain Richard Anderson made the decision that would haunt him forever. He ordered the attack. 6 tanks were destroyed in less than a minute. Within hours, word arrived that Japan had surrendered. Anderson would spend the rest of his life wondering if those tank crews had known the war was over, if they were simply following last orders, if he had killed men who might have survived to see peace. The epilogue to this story came in 1985 at a reunion of Pacific War veterans in Honolulu. Former P-47 pilot William Patterson met former Japanese tank commander Yoshio Kobayashi. Through an interpreter, Kobayashi said something that stopped conversation in the room. "Your Thunderbolts saved Japan. If you had not destroyed our tanks from the air, we would have fought on the beaches. Millions would have died. Your Marines, our soldiers, our civilians. The tanks you destroyed were already dead. You just made it quick. For that, I thank you." Patterson's response, recorded by a documentary crew present at the reunion, captured the complex emotions of those who had participated in this one-sided campaign. "I've carried guilt for 40 years about the boys we killed in those tanks. To hear you say we saved lives by taking lives, I don't know if that makes it easier or harder, but I'm glad we could meet as old men rather than having killed each other as young ones." The story of Japan's tanks and America's Thunderbolts ultimately reveals a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Technological superiority can render courage irrelevant, but it cannot eliminate the human cost of its application. The P-47 pilots who turned Japanese tanks into burning coffins were instruments of strategic necessity, delivering death with industrial efficiency to prevent even greater death. The Japanese tank crews who died in their obsolete vehicles were victims of a military system that valued spiritual determination over material reality. Both were young men caught in forces beyond their control, asked to perform duties that would mark them forever. The P-47 Thunderbolts' dominance over Japanese armor stands as perhaps the starkest example of technological mismatch in World War II. It demonstrated that in modern warfare, the side with superior technology and industrial capacity doesn't just win, it can render the enemy's resistance meaningless. The Japanese tanks destroyed in those final months were not defeated in battle. They were simply erased by a superior system of war. This truth, that courage and determination, mean nothing against overwhelming technological superiority. remains one of the most disturbing lessons of the Pacific War. A reminder that in the arithmetic of modern conflict, spirits cannot stop bullets, and steel that's too thin might as well be paper.